Chapter 2. Vulnerable Judah. For the Hebrews, the devastation that Assyria inflicted in 701 BC was no isolated ordeal. Four other times in the previous third of a century, the imperial army stormed into the territory of either Israel or Judah. Hebrew history over the millennia abounds with times of disaster, and among the most harrowing was this period of Assyrian hegemony. The empire's reasoning for wanting to bring Israel and Judah to heel had little to do with religion or ethnicity, and everything to do with happenstance of geography. The two kingdoms were located in what was at the time the world's most intensely coveted regions, the end of the Fertile Crescent that abuts the eastern Mediterranean. Assyria wanted control of this territory. Some of the world's most lucrative overland trade routes passed through Israel and its immediate coastland neighbors, Philistia and Phoenicia. Judah, stuck up in the highlands to the south, was less strategically located, but was within easy striking distance of some of the most important routes. Three Philistine cities on the coast or near it, Gaza, Ashdod, and Ashkelon, were the major outlets of the thriving trade within Arabia. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos to the north were the great ports of Phoenicia, a seafaring powerhouse whose ships fanned out across the entire Mediterranean. Possessing only meager natural resources, Assyria relied on international trade to sustain its economy. Hayim Tadmor, an expert on the empire, hypothesizes that Assyria's internal interest in the region was largely motivated by the aim of dominating the Mediterranean seaports and gaining control over commerce. The region also served as a land bridge for armies marching between Mesopotamia and Egypt. If Assyria was to invade the Nile Valley, its forces would have no choice but to pass through the general area, lying as it did between desert and sea. Because this book will refer constantly to this region, the theater of war in 701, a precise name for it could be useful. The familiar names, however, don't fit. Canaan, for example, covers too small of a territory, and Middle East, Near East, and Levant apply too large of an area. Let us then use the ancient Egyptian name for the region, Kor. And used here, Kor will include the western end of the Fertile Crescent, the territory encompassing the ancient kingdoms of Judah, Israel, and Philistine lands, Phoenician lands, Syria, and for good measure, the less strategic area near the Dead Sea, occupied by the minor kingdoms of Ammon, Moab, and Edom. This territory corresponds roughly to the modern states of Israel, Palestine, western Jordan, Lebanon, and western Syria. It excludes the Sinai. A generation before Sennacherib's invasion, the two Hebrew kingdoms were of unequal weight, economically and culturally and demographically. Israel was considerably more prosperous, encompassing, as it did, most of the best cropland. In educational and artistic matters, the northern kingdom was also the more advanced. Conventional historians say that Israel, with its 10 tribes, could claim a population at the time of about 800,000, and Judah, with 2 tribes, may have had 200 to 250,000 people. A relatively rigorous estimate based on recent archaeological findings, however, suggests that Judah may have had a population of only 120,000. What is plain is that even by the most generous measures, neither kingdom would have had a population base from which to draw an army capable of standing up to Assyria's. Of all the earlier hostilities between Hebrews and Assyrians, 2 in particular bore on the events of 701 BC. Because Assyrian records corroborate much of the biblical version, minimalist historians do not question the version's general reliability. The first episode took place in 734 BC. The two kingdoms had never been close friends, and at this time Assyria's imperial ambitions in core had the effect of turning the adjoining states into combative enemies. To resist Assyrian encroachment, Israel and Syria became allies and then tried to enlist Judah in their coalition. Judah's king Ahaz refused, and to demonstrate his loyalty to Assyria's king Tiglath-Pileser III, he sent him a substantial tribute of gold and silver. Israel and Syria then fought forcibly to replace Ahaz with a monarch who would rally Judah to the coalition in a conflict known as the Syro-Ephraimite War. Israel invaded Judah and besieged Jerusalem, where Ahaz was holding out. Ahaz defended the city successfully. Judah's subservience to the empire paid off. In 733 to 732 BC, the Assyrian army stormed into Syria and Israel and conquered them both. But they spared Ahaz's neutral kingdom, or chiefdom. The invader chopped Israel's territory into 4 parts. 3 of these segments became provinces of the Assyrian Empire, and the 4th endured as a semi-independent state of Samaria. This rump kingdom, whose capital was also called Samaria, may have measured a scant 45 miles or so in length and 35 miles in breadth, making it about one-third the size of the former Israel. The Assyrian king personally chose an Israelite named Hoshea to be monarch of this tribute-paying mini-state. Israel and Assyria struggled against Judah shows how the Assyrian threat generated intense political pressure within Hebrew society, deepening division not only between Israel and Judah, but within Judah itself. Perhaps the majority of Israel's people, including Isaiah, may have supported Ahaz's dovish policy towards Assyria. A significant portion of Judah's overall population may have favored joining Israel's coalition. A generation later, during the several years that immediately preceded 701, a similar split in public opinion or whether to submit or to rebel against Assyria would surface in Judah. The second and far more serious sequence of events occurred in the years immediately after the king's death in 727. The heretofore docile Hoshea tried to distance Samaria from the great empire. Hoshea gambled that under a new king, Shalmaneser IV, Assyria would no longer seek to keep the far-flung dominion intact. Hoshea ceased paying tribute and sent messengers to Egypt to appeal for military support. Hoshea's timing was poor. Still recovering from the recent internal war, Egypt was in no position to venture abroad to confront mighty Assyria. Shalmaneser did invade the state of Samaria. After subduing it, he imprisoned Hoshea. When rebellious elements continued to fester, the Assyrian encircled the capital, Samaria, and in 723 BC, after a siege of 2 or possibly 3 years, captured it. In 720, after Shalmaneser's death and the return home of the siege forces, Samaria may have found other allies in the area and tried again to free itself. For vassal states that dared rebel, the empire reserved the ultimate penalty: annihilation of the state. This would involve the wholesale deportation of members of the ruling and upper class, priests, government officials, large landowners, soldiers, skilled tradesmen, and other leadership groups. These would be forcibly sent with their families to distant parts of the empire. Replacing them would be a conquered people from other regions. The empire would appoint an Assyrian governor. The strategy was to fill the formerly restive territories' leadership vacuum with disoriented foreigners preoccupied with making a fresh start in life, not with fomenting further trouble. This is what now happened to Samaria. The new Assyrian king, Sargon II, quelled whatever coals of revolt remained and then applied the obliteration solution. He did so by deporting, by his own account, 27,290 inhabitants of the Sumerian territory. This uprooting would have started in 720 and continued to perhaps 715. The Assyrians marched their captives off to remote exile in various corners of present-day modern Syria, Iraq, and Iran. They were never heard from again, together with the untold thousands of Israelites whom Tiglath-Pileser had deported from other parts of Israel in 732. This mass disappearance gave rise to the legend of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Conventional historians say that the lost tribes simply dissolved into the cultures of their new lands. The effect of the deportation that got underway in 720 BC was decisive. Samaria became a pliant Assyrian province called Samarina. Never again would what was left of the northern kingdom make a soupcon of trouble for the empire. The Israelite state's final years provided insight into the events of 701. Hoshea's search for foreign military assistance shows that as early as the 720s, Hebrews had expectations of Egyptian help against Assyria. Even if it appears that the specific southern monarch to whom Hoshea appealed was not forthcoming, calls to Egypt or for help would be made at least twice more in the next quarter century. The very idea of Egyptian intervention in itself was quite extraordinary. For one thing, Egypt had not been militarily involved in war for more than 200 years, when a pharaoh, whom the Bible calls Shishak, had ruled Judea and Israel. For another, the Bible customarily casts Egypt as the Hebrews' adversary. Yet, here in the late 8th century BC, Egypt suddenly surfaces as a friendly neighbor and prospective ally. So far as I am aware, no historian has ever called to attention this pattern of Hebrew reliance on Egypt, but it is very curious. Hosea's unsuccessful quest for military aid from the Nile Valley also helps explain later opposition within Judah towards Hezekiah's attempts to seek help from the source. The most noticeable critic was Isaiah. To rely on Egypt for help, the prophet would warn Judahites after the fall of Israel was self-destructive folly. In addition to these assaults in the northern kingdom, the Assyrians in 712 threatened Judah. The Philistine state of Ashdod had urged Judah and its fellow vassals to join in a revolt against the empire. The imminent prospect of an Assyrian invasion in the end induced Judah to back off and remain loyal to Sargon. Having cowed the kingdom without having to resort to force, Sargon calls himself Judah's subduer. Ashdod did not escape Assyria's wrath. Archaeological evidence at the site shows traces of mass destruction. This was one of at least 3 separate military campaigns the court that did not include Hebrew territory in their itineraries. One can say that the invasion of 701 marked the 8th Assyrian onslaught on Kor within the lifetime of adult Jerusalemites. All of these offensives, including the last one as it rolled relentlessly through Phoenicia, Philistia, and most of Judah prior to arriving at the walls of Jerusalem, had wreaked a degree of terror and destruction that was exceptional even for those brutal times. We easily understand, then, the flight of many Jerusalem's defenders and the profound despair of those people who remained within its walls. From the experience of these other states of Kor, we can conclude that what would have happened to Hebrew society if Assyrians had conquered Jerusalem. Judah was the only surviving part of Hebrew society that was still viable, and Jerusalem was Judah's last remaining city. The Assyrian besiegers had explicitly announced that their intentions to deport the vanquished Judahites en masse to faraway lands, and such actions against the sibling kingdoms of Israel had caused the disappearance of everything having to do with its people's nationality, identity, religion, and culture. It is not much of a jump to assume, then, that if Jerusalem had perished, so would everything having to do with Hebrew identity. This assumption is so logical that virtually every historian accepts it. It is an interpretation with a long and distinguished pedigree. One of the most prominent traditionalist historians of the 19th century, Heinrich Goratz, reaches this conclusion in his landmark work, The History of the Jews. As recently as 1998, another well-known specialist on the period, Mordecai Kogan of the Hebrew University, gave this unqualified testimonial to the importance of Sennacherib's withdrawal. Later generations, looking back on the attack of Judah, viewed it as perhaps the most fateful event in the kingdom's 300-year history to that point. Had Jerusalem fallen, Judah would have gone the way of the northern kingdom of Israel, especially its capital, Samaria, to exile and extinction. Historians have recently started to give respectability to the intellectual exercise that they use to shy away from the what-if game. This is an effort to assess the historical importance of an event by projecting what the effects on the world would have been if that event had a different outcome. If, for example, a battle had turned out the other way, in 1998, the Quarterly Journal of Military History asked 37 historians to identify what they deemed to be the most important might have been in military annals. Not surprisingly, one of them named the Greek Navy's famous upsetting victory over Persia at Salamis. In 480 BC, another cited England's surprise defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. But in its presentation of these great events, this respected journal gave the last word and the implicit place of honor to the nomination of Sennacherib's invasion. The scholar who made this case was William H. McNeill, a professor of the University of Chicago and the author of The Rise of the West, a sweeping work that won the National Book Award for History. McNeill, who subscribed to the idea that an epidemic leveled Sennacherib's forces, wrote, "Had the Assyrians' army remained healthy in 701, Jerusalem would have probably have been captured and its people dispersed, and as had happened in Samaria only 20 years before. Think of what that would have meant. For without Judaism, both Christianity and Islam become inconceivable, and without these faiths, the world as we know it becomes unrecognizable, profoundly and utterly different." He concluded, "Surely there is no greater might have been in all recorded history. If one has reason to doubt the disease theory, such an assessment makes the search for the party responsible for Sennacherib's departure all the more intriguing. What is responsible for this watershed in the history of humanity?"